Before we get started on the panel, we'd really like to hear a few words from our co-sponsor, really the main organizers of this event, from the president of Common Cause, Karen Hobart Flynn. Karen is, I think many of you know her, and almost all of you know of her, has been with Common Cause, she tells me, 28 years as an organizer at the state and national level. She became the 9th president of Common Cause just before the 2016 election. Great timing. And I have to say, as I said yesterday, just what an absolute joy it is to work with Common Cause and how honored we are to be partnered with them on this event. So it's with pleasure that I introduce Karen Hobart Flynn.
Good morning, everybody. Great to see you here. Yesterday was a great day, and I'm really looking forward to today. I wanted to thank Fritz, the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, and also the Duke Center for Political Leadership, Innovation, and Service for co-sponsoring this event. And I also want to thank Common Cause National staff and Common Cause North Carolina staff for all their work to help pull this together. The truth is, though, it would not be successful if you didn't come and join us for this conference and focused your time and energy on this issue. We all know in the last round of redistricting, Republicans created a master plan to secure state legislatures so they could draw lines that created uber-safe districts. And the truth is, there are also states, we have some folks here from Illinois, from Maryland, Democrats do this too. And what that does is diminish people's voice in their democracy. And it is so important for us to be fighting back. The truth is, these kinds of issues are issues of taking on power. And people do not cede power easily. And the only way we combat that is to engage people in this fight. To me, I have been amazed at just in the last 2 years how many people have engaged and want to fight gerrymandering. Across the country, we have seen thousands of activists who know very little about the issue come and want to engage. From the Citizens Redistricting effort in Michigan, the ballot initiative that just won in 2018, which I'm sure we'll be hearing more about today, to work in Ohio, where Catherine Terser had worked to pass a ballot measure in May the year before, so during the primary season. So we are seeing activists come and engage in ways we haven't before. It's also because of the hard work of many of our friends and allies. Here in North Carolina, like Blueprint, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, the League of Women Voters, New Virginia Majority, Friends of the Earth, Voters Not Politicians, and many others, and including authors like David Daley, who wrote Rat Fucked, I said the word, and talk about, so it's accessible for people, about what happened and why it matters. It's a great read, and if you have not read it, I urge you to. You know, not only do people know now what gerrymandering is, they know what's wrong with it. And 10 years ago, when we would talk about gerrymandering or redistricting, people didn't know what we were talking about. And when we had gatherings, we'd have 15, 20, 30 people coming together to talk about it. And as we have looked at doing these conferences, we have done this in North Carolina because you know the damage that gerrymandering can do. And we've also seen this conference grow over time. Some say that North Carolina is the epicenter for gerrymandering, but I actually see North Carolina as a tipping point, a place where we are going to see reform. And I think that is so important. We have seen reform creeping up and popping up all across the country. 5 states passed ballot initiatives in 2018 on gerrymandering. In 10 weeks, we're going to be having the best test case go to the Supreme Court on partisan gerrymandering. And it was very exciting to hear about the date. It is amazing. The mathematicians, the academics, the statisticians, and others come and work together with amazing litigators to be taking on racial and partisan gerrymanders in this country. And so to me, that is what gives me hope. And I hope that later, I think it's our second panel, will find a little time for our friends at the League of Women Voters in Michigan to talk about a breakthrough in their litigation in Michigan, where they filed a motion yesterday for approval of a consent decree to settle the League's gerrymander litigation around redrawing 11 state House districts. They've come to agreement with Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State in Michigan, actually was chair of Common Cause Michigan a number of years ago, and a remarkable reformer. So I'm hoping we'll hear a little bit about that at our second panel. Because these wins are cropping up, it matters so much. So one other thing, I know that some of our staff have been asking you to memorialize your commitment to gerrymandering, ending gerrymandering. So I'd like you to pull out your phones or your laptops and visit www.endgerrymanderingpledge.org and take a pledge. Tell the world that you will support an advanced, fair redistricting that is transparent, non-discriminatory, and politically impartial. So I'll say it again. Go to www.endgerrymanderingpledge.org. We have a selfie station in the back. Our staff can direct you to it, where you can take your picture and share that on social media. We are going to be using this to pressure state lawmakers and members of Congress to also pass meaningful redistricting reform. So thank you so much for joining us, and I believe that this is a year where we are going to see tremendous progress in ending gerrymandering. So thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. As our panelists are coming up, I will say, as someone who bleeds Tar Heel Carolina blue, isn't this a lovely university and a lovely building? I have to give Duke much credit. Yes. I always have to get the jab in whenever I can, but we really are grateful to the Sanford School and its support of what we've been able to do. This is the second conference, as many of you may know. And I will just say real quickly, it's just heartening to see so many of you all here. We had a great day yesterday, but particularly those of you who've come from another state. For those of us who've been around, and as Karen referenced, we've seen this grow nationally in North Carolina, and it's wonderful for us to have you all here today. So whether it's the epicenter or tipping point, I like that, what Karen referenced about North Carolina. It's big here. I mean, I guess as in the program, we talk about unique challenges and opportunities. So we've got a great panel here to talk about those opportunities and challenges we have ahead, and figure we might as well get to it. I will just quickly let everyone know a little bit about who they are. Vivian Jones, one of the municipal leaders of North Carolina, the mayor of Wake Forest, who has affirmatively told us she is for ending gerrymandering, and we appreciate that. Seated next to her, Tom Ross, who has done so much for this great state of North Carolina and now is working with an organization that he has co-founded, North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform. Tomas Lopez, who is the executive director of arguably one of the great good government nonprofits in America, Democracy North Carolina. Yeah, they deserve. I came to Common Cause 19 years ago, and I wouldn't still be standing here were it not for his fine organization. They have helped me out so much, and we're privileged to be a partner. Finally, I think it's my colleague there on the end, whom, Jan, I need to make amends, I guess, from yesterday a bit. But Jane Penske has been in this fight with me for about a dozen years. She heads up something called the North Carolina Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform, again, dedicated to the issue of trying to slay the gerrymandering monster we have here in North Carolina. So, all right, yeah, that's good. A hand to everybody. Why don't I just kind of throw out again to everyone, and we can just start from Mayor Jones, you first. Why are you involved in this, and what opportunities do you see this year to push redistricting reform forward?
Well, I'm involved in it just simply because I see it as something that we need to fix. And I think that this is probably the best time we've had in a long time to make some changes. I actually got into politics because of districting. Because some people way back in the 90s, Wake Forest was a little bitty town, and some people wanted us to. We are an at-large. We are a nonpartisan at-large election for our town government, and some people wanted to divide us into districts, and we had about 12,000 people. So I said I didn't think that was a good idea at that time. Maybe later on. And now we're getting close to the point where we might have to start thinking about that, because we're now at 44,000. But anyway, that's how I got into it. After I spoke against districting in Wake Forest, people said they wanted me to run, so I did. And I've been on the board since I was on the board for 2 years and then elected mayor. But I think that this is the time that we can make a difference, and so that's why I'm here.
Tom, if you want to take the same question, we'll just go around the.
So I think I said yesterday, but I'll say again, I think it's maybe the most important issue, or certainly one of the top issues facing us, at least if we care about democracy, because it is, I think, created a democracy that's not functioning well. And as a result, I believe we have become increasingly divided as a nation, unable to solve our problems, and I worry about that. I think now's the time for a couple of reasons. When you are chronologically gifted, as I'm beginning to be, this only happens every 10 years, so you only get a bite at the apple every 10 years, and so I'm not prepared to wait around another 10 years, and so I think that's one reason now's the time. But more practically, I think, as I said yesterday, there's a lot of uncertainty right now, and even more after yesterday. And the more uncertainty there is, the better chance we have for reform.
I think many of us are here because we believe that we'd all be better off if more of us, more of our peers, more of folks in communities, especially our most underrepresented, excluded communities, took part in our democracy. And democracy is ultimately a deal. And as in exchange for your participation, you're going to get some say, and you're going to get ultimately prosperity and security. Gerrymandering attacks that at a very fundamental level, because it says to people, don't bother taking part. It doesn't matter anyway. And so when we look at or our organization tries to create cycles of participation and reform, because we believe that reform won't happen unless you have a critical mass of low-income voters, of black and brown voters, of young people actually engaging in a system that has been set up in many ways to keep them out. But you will not have people participate. You will not bring people into the political process unless you actually lower those barriers and they believe their political participation has meaning. And political participation can't have meaning unless we resolve this issue. And so I think that this year there's an opportunity to continue pushing this forward. And I would say, too, that it's in a larger picture, at least in this state, of giving people something positive to push on. Because in the arc of things in North Carolina, folks have been dealing with, not just on democracy issues, but especially on these issues, years and years now of things to be against, things to be angry about. And this represents a way forward. And I think it's not the only thing that has to be moved forward, but it sure is really important.
I feel a little silly and corny with what I'm going to say after what the previous panels have said, but I started working on good government because I have grandparents who were immigrants, and one of them fled Russia with the Tsar's troops on his heels because he dared to speak out. What he said obviously was not what the Tsar wanted to hear. He came to the United States and he made it clear to his children and his grandchildren that he came so that he could have a voice and a vote in what was happening in our country. And I started this job feeling that I owed him making sure that everybody has a voice and a vote, that he risked his life literally so that I could be here. So that was a start. Well, I now have a 3-year-old grandson, and as I watched the Supreme Court appointments, I realized that what we were doing now would affect his life when he was 30, and that what we are doing now in North Carolina will affect 1-, 2-, and 3-year-olds when they are 30. And we need to have citizens speak up and take part. And as Tomas just said, if people think their voice doesn't count, then they're not going to speak up. They're not going to take part. They're not going to go to the polling place. So that we need to make this change. And my new favorite quote this week is from Thomas Jefferson. It is not the majority who will decide what happens. It is the majority who participate who will decide what happens. We need to make sure that that majority who participates is as close to every North Carolinian as it can be. And until we do redistricting reform, the majority doesn't have a voice. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat or Green Party or Constitutional Party or Libertarian Party, your voice doesn't get heard. So why this year? Why this year? Because this is what painters would call a magic moment, magic light. We have a confluence of elections, litigation, and some national politics that put people in a place where they are willing to go out and help make change. And that is a wonderful energy and this is the moment where we can use it.
Very good. So I kind of get a sense from each of you that there's a sense of hope here, and that's a good thing. I want to give some time for you all in the audience to ask some questions, but let me just pose a couple. Gerrymandering is bad unless it's your party in power. That's kind of the way it has been. I mean, in the legislature, and even we are a politically almost evenly divided state. So my question, and Mayor Jones, I'll start with you, but I'd like to hear each of you is, what is our message to the people? This is sort of the outside game, and particularly to Republican and independent citizens here who may think, hey, you know what? I like the people who are in power in North Carolina. I kind of get that gerrymandering is bad, but the folks that I voted for are in power. How do we convince them to connect with their representatives to support reform?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the answer to that question. I'm a Republican. I have been a Republican all my life. I grew up in Randolph County. If any of you from North Carolina, you know that's kind of a hotbed of Republicanism. And so my daddy was a Republican, so I signed up too. And back in those days, a lot of people registered as Democrats because the Democrats were in power, and they registered as Democrats so they could vote in the primary because they knew whoever won the primary, Democratic primary, was going to win the election. But my daddy said, no, you can't do that. You have to stand for what you believe in. So I have taken that as my mantra for my life, to stand for what I believe in. Now, there are Democratic politicians in this room that I have supported and voted for and worked for. And so I think that the best thing that we can do is for each one of us to look at our politicians and ask them what they stand for and vote for the ones who stand for the things that you want to see, no matter what party they are. We've got to learn to work together. And if we don't, we won't ever accomplish anything.
Very good. Tom, you want to take the...
Sure. Yeah. I mean, It's I think there are a lot of different messages actually, and I think it depends a little bit on who you're speaking with at the moment. But some of the core messages seem to me is that if you care about North Carolina and if you care about the future of this country and our form of government, then you want a democracy that in some way resembles what our founding fathers thought about and what their vision was for America. And that is one in which the people elect representatives, and representatives lead the people and the government in positive ways and solve our problems and work together. And that's not happening right now. That vision of a republic, a representative democracy, is really not what we have, because only a few people in many districts matter in the outcome, because they're so heavily gerrymandered and so safe that the only risk, as I said yesterday, is being primaried by somebody further to the extreme in your party. And so I think if we want a democracy that works, then it requires participation. And as Tomas said, right now there's not much incentive for many people to participate. So we have to get back to a way in which we have races that are competitive, in which politicians have to listen to the voters, all the voters, not just some of them, and that voters can hold politicians accountable in a way that can't be done very well right now. So I think there are a lot of messages and a lot of reasons why gerrymandering is not good for our future. But I think the most important one is, as I said yesterday, it creates a disincentive for compromise, an inability to solve problems. And we have a lot of problems that need our attention. And if we can't figure out a way to make our democracy work better and solve those problems, I worry a great deal about our future and the future of this form of government.
One of the underlying issues behind people's lack of participation is the fact that I think there are a lot of people who view the political process in general, and perhaps redistricting in particular, as an abstraction. That it's another set of things that they have to worry about, that they don't see has an effect on their everyday lives. And I think that one thing that I think we need to communicate, and I would challenge folks in the room to communicate, is this idea that the decisions that get made, whether here or at the later on in the chain, do affect people's lives. Because it's going to be, in my own view, and I think in my organization's view, what we're trying to go is to a place where people identify with the political process, but less with political parties. One of the deep concerns that I have personally with this political moment is that party identification has taken on a sort of identity aspect, and that that maybe isn't totally unprecedented in American history, but I think it is in recent history. And we have to convey the message that you can't be thinking about this problem because of the letter next to your name. That you have to think about this in terms of how it connects to your own life. And I think that there is a challenge in sort of grounding this work and making it less of an abstraction to people.
Again, I'm going to second what everybody else has said. I think parties are increasingly distrusted, and allowing them to do what is basically cheating is not a good message to put out to the voters of the country. If your kid plays on a soccer team and they get to decide the rules, then that's cheating. That is what happens with redistricting reform. We do need to make it part of people's everyday lives. In North Carolina, for me, that would be the farmers who haven't been able to work with the USDA for the last month because the USDA can't be there because our Congress is so polarized. It would be the people here today who had trouble getting out of LaGuardia because TSA workers weren't showing up. It would be planes that were slowed down because air traffic controllers weren't there. And on a state level, you can do that as well. So I think the way we need to keep people involved is to show them that this is not some theoretical concept. This is their everyday life, whether there's a traffic light at the corner or kids get vaccines or Adult Protective Services has enough staff, that all of those things are direct results of gerrymandering.
Very good. We talked yesterday a little bit about principles and what reform should look like. And I'd like to hear again from each of you a little more about that. What is it that we need and want in North Carolina if we're fortunate enough to have bills actually heard by the legislature this year, and we want to optimistically think that's right? Are there some lines in the sand, some things that absolutely must be a part of redistricting reform if things get heard and then there's compromise, what have you? Mayor Jones, I know this is not what the Wake Forest Town Council debates, but you might have some thoughts on that, so let me start with you.
No, we don't debate this. Well, I think that it's, I see in my own, when I go to vote, when I have to go past 2 polling places to my precinct, that to vote, that irritates me. And so I think it's important for us to have neighborhoods and for the representatives to represent the neighborhoods. And so I think that's a very important thing.
So I think maybe most important is transparency, a process that is transparent to the public, gives the public an opportunity for input, helps us understand the methodology and the data, particularly the data that's being used in the process. I think those would go a long way to at least giving more comfort to many of us that a process is working better for North Carolina. I think another piece of it is to eliminate the use of partisan data and any other kind of data that can be used to indicate how people vote. That is, again, not easy to do unless it's done publicly, because there are now people that are very good at figuring out how the computer system worked and what data was used. And so if you have to disclose that data in advance, it can be checked pretty quickly. And you can find out if people are gaming the system. So I think the transparency is really important. What data can be considered is really important. And obviously thinking through standards that can be applied fairly and that don't allow, to the extent possible, partisan and or racial gerrymandering. So those are sort of some key principles the way I think about this. And, I worry a little bit less about who draws the maps than I do what the rules are and how much transparency there is.
I think we would all agree that we need to have a process. We need to have a system. Let's call it a system because process can have a very particular meaning here. We need to have a system that certainly keeps political parties from cheating, as you put it, Jane. But I would also add that we need a system that centers and is aware of racial equity. And there are a lot of ways in which that can happen, and that involves both in the way in which something is designed and in the way in which it is implemented. And I would underscore the point that when we think about redistricting reform and we think about changes to the system, we can't just think about it as, okay, we've passed something, we're done. We know that regardless of what system we have, I know one thing that is important is going to be public involvement. There needs to be a voice for the public to engage in a knowing and meaningful way in the redistricting process. That is how you can center communities. That is how you can center what the voices of the people actually are. And I know that even if we somehow don't get any change to the system in 2021, we are going to have that year people showing up, being a part of it, and making sure that that voice is registered in the broader public.
This time I truly don't have much to add. I think that transparency, involving citizens, keeping partisan data out is crucial. I think we also need to look at the things that are stalking horses for partisan data. You would be amazed, I think, sometimes about the way somebody drawing a map can figure out what your political registration is, the way you tend to vote by things like what magazines you receive, what car you drive, what club you belong to, sometimes even what TV service you use. And unfortunately, most of that is now accessible, at least in groups of data and increasingly as individuals. So I think it's going to require every one of us to be there, a part of the process, and making sure that it is done openly and that nobody's having closed-door conversations.
I'm going to ask one other question, and I'm assuming I'm looking back and we'll get the microphones. Do we have where we'll, yeah, we're going to be able to do that. This can be a quick answer, and you'll are, again, kind of a repetitive question, but as far as obstacles, what's the biggest obstacle? This is a complicated, complex issue, and everyone in this room knows much more about it than if we were to drive east, west, north, south in this state. There's so many people that they really, there's more awareness, but still, a lot of folks don't know about it. You know, is it education? There's some very practical obstacles, like how do we get the majority party to agree to do this and keep the other folks who say they're for reform on board as well. But Mayor Jones, I'll start with you again. Just what do you think would be one of the top obstacles in us moving forward?
Well, I think it's education of the public, of all of our friends and neighbors and people involved, but also education of our legislature to let them know that this is something that we demand.
Actually, we've done some polling that indicates exactly what you say, Bob, that there's a large segment of North Carolinians who really don't understand what gerrymandering is, what the problem is. And so I think public education is going to be very, very important. And it's education for lots of reasons, one of which is to get more people interested and engaged in the debate and discussion around gerrymandering, because, you know, politicians, in the end, even though we're in a gerrymandered world where they have to pay attention to a smaller number of voters, they still have to pay attention. And so to the extent that we can generate public support and public interest in this topic, and you know so that legislators know this is something really important to the voters of both parties, and I think there is a lot of bipartisan support for this. I don't think it's a partisan issue. You know, we have a long history of gerrymandering in North Carolina. Both parties have used it quite well. Both parties have members who have been quite hypocritical on this issue, who've been for it when they're out of power and against it when they're in power. And so I think we need to call them out, and the public needs to understand that, and we need to get people demanding change. And that's going to require a lot of work and a lot of effort by a lot of people.
And as Tom says, that education, I think one of the things that it has to overcome is fatigue. All of us are carrying around phones that are yelling at us every few minutes about something else to be angry about, something else to be angry about in the political process, something else, some other politician did this, what did so-and-so do today, who tweeted what. And it is very easy for this to just get caught up in that soup. And having a degree of differentiation on this issue, I think, will be a really important thing, but I do think it's a challenge that I can't answer for you right away.
I agree. Education, I think we need to recognize that for most people, in terms of, as someone used in the meeting I was just in, their hierarchy of needs, this is someplace after 10,000. You know, you got to go to work, you got to keep your car going, you got to pay your mortgage, you want to get your kid to soccer, you got to take care of your parents. Somehow, redistricting reform doesn't make it onto that list. And I think the thing we need to do is tell people how it affects the 9,999 things before it, how it affects their daily lives, and how they can, as an individual, speak out. I am constantly amazed at the number of people that I think of as smart and, vote every year and are politically acute, who've never talked to their legislator, who are afraid to talk to a legislator, who are terrified to talk to a congressman, who, when they do, don't want to disagree with the person. And I think we need to, as part of our education, get people past that. I will reiterate something I said yesterday. We polled every candidate running for the legislature this year, and we published something called the Fair Maps Pledge. I would challenge everybody in this room who comes from North Carolina to go online, look at how the person who represents you voted or said they would vote, and then tell them thank you or tell them you need to change. And then do that with 10 people that you work with. And you may have to educate them before they'll do it about why this matters to them.
Very good. And to kind of, again, play off of that, the power of the pledge is immense. And it is, as Jane mentioned, something that we can all do to hold these folks accountable. And that is a very good thing to do. I think we've got 20 minutes, and it's certainly an opportunity for you all to ask questions. I see, I'm seeing you first. A microphone is coming your way.
One thing that I know everyone on the panel knows, but I think it's important for everybody else to know, is that we have a unique opportunity because for the first time ever that I know of, the Democratic platform in North Carolina in the 2018 election had ending gerrymandering and promoting independent, nonpartisan redistricting. I think that is something that's really important to tell people, especially, people who are disenchanted with any political party, saying that Democrats have come around and that this is a real opportunity. So I just wanted everyone to know that there's that glimmer of hope and one point that you can make in favor.
Very, very good, and that's a good point. Tony, I saw your hand. You want to ask a question, and that's a good point because, as Tom mentioned, the Democrats were doing the same thing when they were in power. It's good to make sure that everybody knows they're for reform. Tony?
Tony Quaterero, Raleigh. As Jane said, soccer games and cheating. When you play basketball on the playground, it's no blood, no foul. But I would submit that with gerrymandering, what has happened in North Carolina, blood has been drawn and there have been fouls. I haven't heard anybody talk about, and I would like to know, why are there no civil or criminal penalties for people disenfranchising other people, perpetuating this? We've had how many years now of lawsuits and maps and obfuscation and pushing back and not getting new districts for the 2018 election. And we just go on and on and on. It's a lawyer's breakfast, pig breakfast, every day, and we, the public, are screwed every day.
Yeah, as a lawyer,
don't make the laws.
Yeah, as a lawyer, I
People who make the laws.
can say that it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner for lawyers because we've, as I said yesterday, for the last 5 decades has been litigation start to finish, and that's not a way to run a democracy. And I think there probably there is a discussion and a debate about the issue you raise around criminal penalties for people who do it. I think part of the question is, what would you make illegal in a nation of where the First Amendment's important, where people have different political views? And so I think you have to be a little careful about that. On the other hand, we ought to be a nation where we are encouraging every single person who's eligible to vote to vote. And even in the 2016 election, which I think most would agree was pretty hotly contested, less than 50% of eligible voters in America voted. Less than 50%. Again, that doesn't say much about the democracy, that less than half the people are making the decisions. And there are lots of reasons for it. It's not as easy as it should be in the United States to register to vote. I've said before, if you're going to have a voter ID bill, then when you get your ID, you ought to be automatically registered to vote, because then you presumably are protected from any kind of problem if you've got that ID, right? That's the theory. So let's register people. I think people need to get behind changes in election laws that make it possible for more people to vote, to be more people to be engaged in the operation of our republic if we want it to survive.
One thing I'll add to that is that you raised an important point, but it's not just a question of what we're doing in the statutes, but it's also how we're using the courts and the remedies that courts can apply. And I think one of the things that we've seen in North Carolina is that, we've had we've had a number of court decisions that have said, hey, your districts are illegal. The underlying principles under which your legislature has been elected has been illegal. But one can argue that maybe there hasn't been enough teeth behind the actual solutions behind that. New lines are drawn, and there's this, it becomes a cat and mouse race. And so some of it is also kind of the ways in which, and it's not necessarily lawyers' fault per se. It's kind of in the broader water of the legal system.
I'm just going to reiterate what the mayor said. Think about who writes the laws.
Mark, you got the mic.
Yeah, so Mark Nance on the Board of Common Cause North Carolina, and one of the takeaways for me yesterday was the need to begin thinking sort of beyond litigation, although I found the discussion and look forward to the discussion of litigation today. I found it interesting yesterday, but so I want to, in that regard, think a little more and maybe push a little bit more, Tom, on what you said about the need for transparency, and I agree 100% that I think that's probably the most important thing that we can do in this. So, for example, on the question of data and say what data can't be used, should we be talking instead about specific lists of what data can be used? Because delimiting the sort of available data is sort of an impossible, you have an incomplete contracting problem, right? There's no way you're going to be able to list all the data that can't be used. So should we be thinking about specific kinds of data that can be used? And Tomas, in the same thing, which you emphasized participation, and I agree with that as well. What does meaningful participation look like? If you were to sort of write that standard, what would it mean?
Well, on the data question, I think probably a combination is what we need. I mean, clearly we have to use demographic data, certainly the number of people, if we're going to comply with the federal Constitution and our own state laws regarding the number of people, the variation that's allowed within a district, one person, one vote. So demographic data has to be used. We have to use other demographic data to comply with the Voting Rights Act. That's critical and important. And I think beyond that, it is really not critical that we use much else in terms of data. But I think it's important to say what we're not going to let people use and to have that data that is going to be used disclosed in advance so that we can determine, because you're right, you can't list everything. So, the provisions that we think ought to be included, for example, not only say partisan registration information, political voting history information, but any other data that can reasonably be used to determine how someone votes. Well, that's a big sort of nebulous subset of data. So if you're required to disclose what you're using in advance, if you're going to be using data about what magazines people read or where they shop or whatever else you might get from Facebook or whoever's selling it, you need to be able to disclose that up front. And that, I think, that transparency is really critical because we can't, it's hard to police the data if we don't know up front what's being used.
So as a standard, I think meaningful participation begins with public hearings, but I think there could be a set of standards that talk about geographic, racial, other forms of demographic inclusion in the kinds of hearings and the kinds of places that's happening. I think there could be mechanisms, and the reason I'm being vague is because I think that there are a lot of different ways you can do it, and I don't want to commit, right here to it. And there could be mechanisms in terms of whether on the map drawing process, the map approval process, that could involve the public in some way or some subset of the public. I mean, I do think that's one of the things that I think people find appealing about independent commissions is the idea that there could be ways to build that in. There's also a sense on the non-standard side, so on the side, take this out of the people writing the statutes or the constitutional amendments, that those of us in civil society can be doing things we can be doing to ensure public involvement. We don't have Section 5 anymore, or fully empowered Section 5, and we don't have that oversight function. And that's going to make it really important to make sure that all of us here, or wherever we are, that there are communities thinking about what should our own maps look like. How can we gain a certain level of technical expertise in the redistricting process? And maybe that's not a mass level of technical expertise. Like you said, I think Maslow probably wouldn't put the efficiency cap very high on that hierarchy, but there are people out there who want to be doing that, and I think we need to leverage that.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes left. Harry, I see you. Let's try to get as many questions in. Harry, you asked your question. I see Senator Guru next to you. Hand the mic to her, and then we'll get to another one. Go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll let 3 questions come up, and then we'll answer.
Okay, well, Vivian, I don't know you, but I know all the rest of you, and you guys have heard me talk about this for the last half dozen years or so. And in order to get people to engage, we have to engage with them. In order to educate them, they need to know, they need to have a passion to know what we're talking about and a passion for a democracy. And in order to build that critical mass, and we are in the 2-minute drill. This is like the end of the game right now in 2019. How are we going to engage 1 million people? How are we going to engage 2 million people in North Carolina to care enough to engage in trying to make changes? I know what I'm doing, but I don't know what everybody else is doing and what your suggestions are, because we get honed down to the details of what data is used and all sorts of these tiny little details that are important at some point, but they're not important right now. What's important is those people walking on the street and walking in downtown Durham site are become involved with us and understand how frightening the future is without a democracy.
Okay, how do we engage folks? Senator Guru, I know you had your hand up. We'll get your in one or more question.
Thank you, and I appreciate this panel and certainly understand the issue. I want to mention too, I want us to step back one step and remember that we have a census coming up, and that census needs to be taken fairly across all the states. And I don't know that in North Carolina we are really aware of the fact how many people we're losing in our census, but that's a part of what we are doing when we look at redistricting and the fulfilling of the obligations of the federal government for the state of North Carolina. My only suggestion would be to have a group like Common Cause do a draft election schedule, do a draft redistricting form, and that might be something that you could send out. And certainly the issues you say of reaching people is very hard. I can't remember in my 14 years having more than 2 people ask me about redistricting.
Very similar in terms of the education. I guess we're all up here in the front, maybe just this gentleman here.
Yes, I'd like to know what you think about what a redistricting commission should look like, independent, bipartisan, to get to a process that assures fair maps, that would be accountable, transparent. It's up to the legislature to decide. And we've had a couple of bills in the past that would have redrawn the process. Sorry, thank you. And I'm wondering what you think it ought to look like. Can we get legislators to respond to a proposal for independent or bipartisan, either one? And we've got some models from other states. What should we be thinking about for North Carolina in terms of getting the process underway?
We got 5 minutes. Tomas, I'm going to say, answer how do we engage people. Then I'm going to let everybody weigh in on what a commission should look like, because there are certainly different ideas.
So I think on the engagement question, you actually, Senator Grew, mentioned the census, and I think that the census actually could end up being a really valuable opportunity to explain in a more concrete way what redistricting means to people. So I think if folks are looking for something, that's one thing. I think a second thing that I would add is that there is, again, an important angle on, we do a lot of work trying to leave historically and systemically excluded communities and bring them into the political process. And you cannot talk about these issues without talking about race, without talking about racial equity. This issue needs to be put in very real terms, especially, not exclusively in those communities, but everywhere we talk about that, and make sure that that's not getting left out as well.
Independent commission, perfect not being the enemy of good. We all have ideas. Tom, do you want to go first? And what thoughts do you have about a commission and what it should look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question is whether a commission is politically possible in North Carolina. And I think it's difficult, frankly, to arrive at a commission that could be passed by the General Assembly, because there is distrust between the parties. So when you say something is going to be independent or bipartisan, there's immediate suspicion that that's not even possible in the minds of many legislators. So then you have to put on top of that the realistic concern that legislators are hesitant to give up power, and so to delegate the responsibility or primary responsibility for drawing districts to someone else is also a challenge, I think, in the current environment. So that's why I think our group is focused on what the rules are and transparency in the process, as opposed to, my own experience in this goes back more than just the last day or two. And, this state has gotten stuck on the question of a commission, and you can't even advance the discussion very far because of the distrust of how it would be selected, who would pick the members, how many of this party or that party. And it's always, actually the discussion often is how many of this party and how many of that party. And a third of North Carolinians are unaffiliated. So are they going to be included? How are you going to fix it? It's just a really hard debate that I fear will interfere with our ability to get some sort of reform before the 2021 census data is available and we're drawing new districts. I'm not opposed to it at all. I think there are ways it could be done. We've seen that in other states where districts, but most of the states that have a so-called independent commission or bipartisan commission, those were created by referendum, where the public had the opportunity to take it straight to the voters, and we don't have that choice here. We have to get it through the legislature.
Other thoughts, Mayor Jones, Tomas, Jane?
I do think that we can have a bipartisan commission. I think that the legislature would be willing to set that up, and I think we have to set up the criteria that they will use. Remember that the legislature can approve it at the end, and I want to respond also about using the information to set up the maps, to use the information that you can use and not what you can't use. I agree that using the criteria that you can use is a better way than saying what you can't use, because I'm used to working with the legislature because the a town in North Carolina is we are the there only because the legislature allows us to be there. And we can't do anything unless they say we can do it. And just because it doesn't say we can't do it, that doesn't mean that we can do it. So if we see that we want to do something, but the legislature hasn't said that we can do it, then we can't do it. And so if you set up a bipartisan commission and tell them what they can use and stick to it. Yeah, it has to be an open process, but they can be made to stick to that.
Tomas.
I mean, I would say on the independent redistricting side, I would just underscore what Tom said, that you've got a third of voters who aren't identifying with any political party. That proportion of the electorate in North Carolina is growing. And I think that in terms of what's realistic, I mean, I think I'm very hopeful, but at the same time, I'm not really necessarily counting on that happening this year.
I don't think we're ever going to get all the people engaged the way we think we can. I mean, I've been in local government now for almost 20 years, and we try everything we possibly can to get people engaged. You know, we have public hearings, yes. We have them all over town. We have online. We have mail-outs. We have everything we can possibly do to get people engaged. And there's about 50 people in town who will show up. And unless it's something in their backyard that they don't want. That's the only time they'll come. They won't come and fight for what they want. They only come and fight for what they don't want.
Jane.
I think in the best of all possible worlds, we would have a totally independent commission. I am baffled by the way we could create that in North Carolina. And I have now seen North Carolina spend a lot of years working on this problem. As we said yesterday, the first bill was more than 50 years ago. I think anything we can get that decreases the power of an individual party and decreases the distance that the process is from people is a big step forward. And all of you in this room are smart enough to know we never get exactly what we want in the legislative or political process, but we push as hard as we can for what we want and then decide where we're willing to compromise and where we're not. For me, that is that the process be transparent and transparent from beginning to end. That means that all the drawing of the map is done in public, not in a back room. And it means that partisan data cannot be part of what is being considered. And partisan data in no way. Not where somebody lives, not maintaining the core of a previous district, no partisan data. It should be about population, communities, the compactness of the district. And I know people think that sounds silly, but if you're a legislator who has to drive 300 miles from one end of your district to the other, to go around a lake or something, you're not going to be out among your constituents. So I think we need to look at all of those. We need to push as hard as we can for the best we can get, and then just keep pushing. This is a process that will never end. We will be working to get our best for a long time.
Very good. Well, I think we are out of time, and as I see 2 minutes, I guess. I don't know that there's time for another question per se, but maybe I can just kind of wind up. And as the blinds were going up, now they're going down. I was going to use the metaphor to say more sunshine, and somehow, this is it fits in somehow. But let me just say this again, kind of in conclusion. And kind of circling back to the beginning of the obstacles and challenges that we have, not only in North Carolina, but across the country, but just great folks, 4 of them here who are in North Carolina, lending their energy and their time to this effort. And then all of you all here, and those of you in other states especially, we've got to be optimistic. We've got to be hopeful. And those obstacles and challenges that we have, I guess, unfortunately, are in many other places too, but convenings like this are helpful in moving forward. And so I want to thank again our great panel here and for everything you do. So join me in thanking them.